the Russian Revolution had been, at least for the time being in Russia, erased completely, and the Chinese Revolution had given birth to a much more serious threat in some ways to United States imperial control of the world than the Soviet Union had ever done. I decided to write a comparative essay on the Russian and Chinese revolutions after rereading Isaac Deutscher's very remarkable essay, basically on the origins of and success of Maoism, which he published in, I suppose, 1961, something like that, and which I don't think anybody had, as it were, taken up, because that was a great historian of the Russian Revolution, looking for the first time at what was different in the Chinese Revolution. But of course, in the intervening years, the relationship between the two states and the two revolutions had become reversed. By the time I was writing, the Russian Revolution had been, at least for the time being in Russia, erased completely. And the Chinese Revolution had given birth to a much more serious threat in some ways to United States imperial control of the world than the Soviet Union had ever done. So that's what I was attempting to kind of look at, what was the difference and what explained the difference between the two, and what explained in particular the difference between the attempt to reform Stalinism in Russia by Khrushchev, which failed completely, which was a genuine attempt, which Deutscher followed very much and with passionate interest, but this completely failed. And the much more successful, if ambiguous, achievement of Deng Xiaoping and his successors in reforming the legacy of Mao and so on, and creating something completely new in Mao. And so it was about the survival and success of one revolution, which had learnt some lessons and so on from the failure of the other revolution. That was roughly the idea which I wanted to discuss. It was an attempt to understand and so on what are the reasons for as it were, these two completely different trajectories and their outcomes. What the reasons for that were. The comparison is vulnerable to criticism. My Chinese wife published very good criticisms of it and so on. She was involved, after all, in the attempt of 1989 to change, to as it were, challenge and so on, as it were, the kind of reform that Deng Xiaoping was making. And she makes some very good criticisms of the essay. Yeah, her criticism is really twofold. Firstly, that I greatly underestimate the international and global achievement of the Russian Revolution. Even if the Soviet Union disappeared, it was far more, as it were, important and transformative than is implied by my account of it, and so on. So she wants to rectify the balance and so on there. And second, she believes that, or argues that my account of the Chinese reform of the reform period of the 80s till the present is insufficiently critical and so on, although she admits and so on, I do make, as it were, quite sharp criticisms. It's not critical enough in her eyes and so on, and underestimates, it glosses over the possibility that existed in her eyes in the late 1980s, around 1989, of the Maoist system needed radical reform, certainly after the failure of the Cultural Revolution, but there were two paths, one which led towards the kind of capitalist economy and structure and highly authoritarian state which you have in China today, and the other which was actually from the beginning much more concerned with the actual socialist values and so on of the original, as it were, Chinese Revolution, and which led to the uprising of 1989, which was then crushed by the authorities, by the party. So that's, I would say, that's her criticism. She's writing a book at the minute called "The Party and the People," which is going to be an expanded version of her argument. I like that. And it's very different, after all, if you live through a major mass movement, a historical event of such magnitude as 1989 was in China. It was much larger as an event than the 1989 in Europe, which was quite a small business and so on like that. There was no mass movement comparable to what happened in China. You obviously inevitably have a very different sense of the meaning of this period than, you know, if you're observing it and so on as a foreigner from a great distance. It's a different. I hope that the two perspectives are complementary, but that's for others to judge. In a kind of subsequent writing, which I haven't yet published and so on, I raised the question, which is really provoked by her view of what's happened in China, these enormous inequalities and so on in China today, as to whether we shouldn't, looking at Putin and Xi Jinping, have an essay with the title, question mark, Two Counter-Revolutions.